Hello and welcome back to Autistic After Hours. I'm your host Ashra, and today we're going to be talking about the experience of delayed development again as an autistic person, but I specifically wanted to talk about feeling like your development was like on par for most of your life, but then hitting a point where it kind of stopped and reversed almost. And this is a very common thing, I think, for high masking and low support needs autistic people, where we may not have necessarily had very obvious developmental delays in our youth, but then it shifted at a certain point, like in high school or college, and we're going to get way more into that. But before we get into the episode, I wanted to note again that I'm recording from my mom's car. Once again, like last week, I'm actually recording this right after I recorded the last one, so I look the exact same as I did last week. But next week, we will be back to our regular recording in my apartment with my sunglasses on, and I don't have my sunglasses again, which makes me sad because it makes me uncomfortable. But without further ado, we're going to make do and get on with the episode. Quick reminder to follow Autistic After Hours on Instagram. I post original content on there every week. I've been posting a lot of autism-specific stuff on there. And another reminder to please follow along wherever you're listening right now, whether that is on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. It helps me a lot when you press follow or subscribe. And now let's get into the episode. So I think one of the lesser talked about things when it comes to autism, something that I don't see a lot of people talk about, is like the different ways that developmental delays show up for autistic people across the spectrum. So in the DSM-5 criteria, there is level 1, level 2, and level 3. And I know that a lot of people have issues with the leveling system. It's definitely not perfect, but here in the US, that is what is used during diagnosis. I was diagnosed level 1. That means mild support. Level 2 would mean like medium support needs, and level 3 would mean high support needs. Something that I think is common for level 1 or lower support needs autistic people is that we may not have had very obvious developmental delays in our youth. And that could be due to the fact that we are low support needs, or that we may have been high masking. So we may have just generally been able to handle things when we had certain supports in place, like if we had a routine from our school, or if we had support from parents or from teachers. If we had the necessary supports, we may have been able to get by just fine or close to just fine without any significant issues detectable. Or if we were high masking, so maybe we did have some struggles, but we were hiding them very well. All of these things may have contributed to reasons for why developmental delays were not obvious or not there until a certain point. Now, I do want to note that in order to be diagnosed autistic, it is a neurodevelopmental condition. So you must have had developmental differences throughout your life. It's not something that would just show up out of nowhere. However, what I'm saying is that for low support needs autistic people, these developmental issues may just not have been detectable or noticeable until you became burnt out, or until your external environment became too much for you to be able to handle, or for you to be able to mask your way through. This is a very personal and subjective experience, and I am not an expert or a professional, so please always seek out professional advice or talk to a professional to verify things, to seek advice or any sort of help or treatment. But I'm going to talk about my experience today. So my experience is that I definitely had differences. I had like noticeable differences as a kid, as a baby, as a teen. However, I never had anybody specifically like take me aside, or I never was put into like different classes. I was never given extra supports or anything. It was never obvious that I was struggling. It was never obvious that I was autistic until my external environment became too much for me to handle. And that is when things started to really show up. And this didn't really happen until like high school for me. I will say that I certainly had visible autistic traits my entire life, starting from when I was born, since I was a baby. However, I didn't have any noticeable delays. So I never had doctors saying like Ashra is delayed or Ashra is not developing on par with peers, like Ashra is behind what we would expect. Nothing like that ever came up for me as a kid or as a teen. Nothing like that ever came up. And I think this is important to talk about because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this where people think that in order to be diagnosed autistic, you have to have had very noticeable, and people would have had to point out developmental delays. Or if you have, for example, a child who you think may be autistic and they don't have very noticeable delays, but they have autistic traits, I think a lot of people are brushed off in this way. Doctors even will brush people off oh, you're not noticeably delayed, so you cannot be autistic, when this is not the case. So for me, I was never noticeably delayed. In fact, in school settings, I actually excelled. I did really well in school up until a point. And I did have a few instances where I struggled, but it was never anything serious, and it was never anything that really flagged anyone's attention. In school, I was even in gifted programs, which is common for autistic people. We often are put into gifted programs. I always had good grades. I never was pointed out as being socially behind, even though, again, I felt on the inside socially something was going on for me. I just masked it very well, but nobody ever really noticed, or at least not in a way that they took seriously. So while people may have noticed my autistic traits, nobody ever noticed any significant delays, and nobody ever took my autistic traits seriously enough to actually look into it or ask me questions to understand if I was autistic or not. What happened for me though is that once I got into high school, that is when things became a lot more intense for me. And this is, again, common for autistic people, where they don't have any significant delays or issues necessarily that are very obviously observable until a point when it becomes too much, and then things start to come out. And it's not that these things spontaneously started to come out in high school. It's that I was hiding them, or I just had enough supports in place to where they were not obvious until a certain point. So once I was in high school, that is where socially I started to feel really different. That is where I started to really notice that people thought of me differently. People thought of me as weird. It's where my social struggles became a lot more obvious. It is also where the demands of the external world, whether that be with school or with social things or with obligations, with whatever, exceeded my ability to juggle them, exceeded my ability to mask my way through them. And that is when things started to get serious for me. That is when I started to really develop anxiety and depression, because that's when my autistic traits became a lot more obvious because of the amount of pressure that I was under and the amount of supports that were being removed because I was transitioning into adulthood. Once my routine was changed, especially once I was transitioning from high school into college, that is when things got really bad for me. That is when depression and stuff like that got really intense for me. And it's because all of the childhood supports that I had in place with my parents, with school being really predictable, with seeing the same people every single day, following the same routine every single day. Once all of those supports were removed, that is when I could not mask as well anymore. That is when I could not hide my autistic traits as well anymore. It's also when my struggles became a lot more obvious because I didn't have supports in place. And even though people didn't realize they were supporting me in an autistic way by helping me have a routine and by giving me predictability and sameness through going to the same school every day, seeing the same people every day, going to the same classes, it was very predictable. It was very doable for me to blend in and camouflage and mask and present as neurotypically as possible in that situation because I was being supported in doing that. Once those things were taken away, that is when I couldn't keep up. And this is a lesser talked about situation for a lot of autistic people. And I think this is so important because even in diagnosis, this is something that people should know about. Professionals should be aware of this different trajectory that a lot of people follow. A lot of high masking and low support needs autistic people follow this line of development, where they are not pointed out as being obviously delayed. They are not pointed out as having very, very obvious autistic traits. They are not stereotypically presenting autistic, and they are able to keep up. Maybe in certain situations, they're even excelling in school or in certain environments where they are feeling very supported. Maybe they're even excelling, and maybe they're even in gifted programs, things like that. And up until a certain point, they're doing super, super well. But then when those supports are removed, or when they hit burnout and they can't do it anymore, that is when things become serious, and we're often misdiagnosed with sort of the resulting issues that come from being undiagnosed autistic and having support taken away, and, transitioning into adulthood where you are now struggling way more than you used to. All of the supports that you had in place as a child are no longer there. That is when we often are diagnosed with things like anxiety, depression, or personality disorders. A big one is borderline personality disorder. We are often misdiagnosed with these things because those are the things that are presenting obviously when our actual underlying situation is that we're autistic and we've been autistic our whole lives, but we've either been able to hide it or we had supports in place that made it less noticeable. What happened for me is that I was misdiagnosed with social anxiety disorder, which was, I think at the time, entirely a misdiagnosis, even though I was dealing with some level of anxiety and depression. I think I don't exactly have necessarily like social anxiety. I think I ended up developing a social phobia over time. But at the time that I was given the diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, I think it was really just a complete misunderstanding. And what was actually going on is that I was autistic and dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression because of being undiagnosed and feeling like I couldn't navigate life because of it. But so many of us are misdiagnosed because of this. So many of us follow this similar path of not being significantly delayed, not being obviously struggling, not having our autistic traits taken seriously or even noticed at all up until a certain point when, for lack of a better phrase, I guess, SHIT hits the fan. Is that a phrase? I think it is. And then things start to crumble and you start to really struggle. Maybe you hit burnout. And that is often when a lot of us start to try and figure out what's going on for us. Maybe a lot of us go into the field of psychology. We start studying psychology. We start really trying to dig into ourselves, try and understand what's going on. And that is why so many of us are late diagnosed autistic. And I think this is understudied. I think it's not understood well enough. And I don't think there's enough attention brought to this developmental trajectory because so much attention is placed on the sort of stereotypical way of experiencing developmental delays. Like, so many people know the kind of classic hallmark things that people look for when it comes to diagnosing autistic babies or kids, where they look for like language delays, they look for like a lack of eye contact, they look for very picky eating, when a lot of autistic people don't exhibit those things in the same way, or we mask them, or we are able to do those things because we just don't experience issues with those things. And because we don't follow that classic pathway or the stereotypical developmental trajectory, people think it's not possible that you could be autistic when it definitely is. And again, that's not to say that you had no autistic traits. In order to be diagnosed autistic, you must have had autistic traits since you were a child. It's not something that you would just develop randomly. But this kind of developmental path sometimes can look that way, is what I'm saying, where it can look like from the outside you are developing typically, and then all of a sudden things change. But what really is happening is that you just didn't have very stereotypical autistic traits in combination with being high masking, and then your supports are taken away from you and life just gets harder, and that is when things become a little bit more clear. Things can become more obvious. Your struggles can become more obvious. You may experience anxiety, depression, burnout, This is the path I followed. This is very common for high masking, low support needs autistic people. And it is something that I would really like to see more professionals become aware of and learn about. I would like it to be more studied. I would like to see more research on this path, because right now, I think it's very understudied. I think that not a lot of professionals know about it. Even if anecdotally, I think in the social media space, a lot of people know about this. I think that there's a lot of representation for this group of people, specifically for high masking, low support needs autistics. If anything, the social media space is oversaturated with that presentation. However, I think on the side of research and like professionals and psychologists, I think there's a lack of understanding still. And it's sad and it's unfortunate, and it's something that has to change, because people should not be getting repeatedly misdiagnosed because they didn't follow the same development as stereotypically presenting autistic people. That is all I have for you today. I would really like to talk even more about this, perhaps at a time when I don't have to be recording from the car. But thank you for being here, and we will get back to our regular scheduled setting next week with my sunglasses and my apartment. If you are somebody that just listens to the audio, though, this doesn't impact you at all, most likely, because you can't even see me. But thank you again for being here. Be sure to follow along wherever you're listening. As always, remember, autistic adults exist. We deserve awareness, support, community, and acceptance, and I'm so grateful that you're here. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.